the Baen Free Radio Hour.
On the podcast, SCA reenactors fight deadly brawl over pronunciation of ancient Greek warrior caste. It seems the hoplites ran the hoplites through with their speares to decide the matter. Space opera and timeless drama, plus we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of Larry Correa's Son of the Black Sword, all right now. Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour podcast. It's an honor to have you along. I'm Baen Senior Editor Tony Daniel. This time we talk with Christopher Ruocchio about his book, The Howling Dark. This is a big, sprawling science fiction novel set in a far future human empire that encompasses billions of stars and millions of settled planets. Our hero is an empire nobleman who is seeking out the leaders of an alien race that has been destroying human colonies. He's trying to establish if peace or a truce is possible with these rapacious sorts. But the only ones who know where the aliens are a bunch of unscrupulous humans who are quite willing to kill any who cross them. Christopher, you might recognize, is also an assistant editor here at Baen and has occasionally hosted the podcast in the past. The Howling Dark is the sequel to his first book, Empire of Silence, and both of those are put out by Daw, but he is one of ours, as it were, and the book is really excellent, so we'll talk to him about that. And we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of Larry Correa's great high fantasy novel, Son of the Black Sword. Now here's the news. The Baen September hardcovers and original trade paperbacks are at booksellers now. These include 1636 The China Venture by Eric Flint and Ivor P. Cooper. Venture to Save an Empire. The newly formed United States of Europe sends an embassy to the Chinese Empire for all important critical resources no one has ever needed before, at least not before an entire town showed up from 300 years in the future. But China is famously suspicious of foreigners. Can the uptimers and their friends persuade the mandarins to establish trade and diplomatic relations with the young United States of Europe? Their greatest asset is also their greatest curse, knowledge that China is due for decades of mass suffering and civil war. Changes must come, but changes also bring their own deadly consequences. Also out in September is Stellaris, People of the Stars, edited by Les Johnson and Robert E. Hampson. Becoming the People of the Stars. Fundamental transformation, that is what it may take to reach our final destination. And we may not have a choice, as dangers from without and pressure from within human civilization force us to adapt to a new star-traveling heritage. We also may find that Homo sapiens is on its way to becoming a new and unique species, Homo stellaris, the people of the stars. This collection contains original science fiction stories and accessible speculative pieces by top scientists that will take you to that future. Stories from authors such as Kevin J. Anderson, William Ledbetter, Todd McCaffrey, and Sarah A. Hoyt, plus essays on the science behind the fiction from Sir Martin Rees, Astronomer Royal of the United Kingdom, Mark Shellhammer, Chief Scientist for the NASA's Human Research Program, and more. Finally, at booksellers everywhere in September is The Chronicles of Davids, edited by David F. Sharirod. Stories with Maximum Dave. The history of science fiction and fantasy is filled with stories by what we like to call Davids of distinction. Now, for the first time, an anthology by people named David. For everyone, even if your name is anything but David. Read along as editor David F. Sharirod guides you through these strange, wondrous imaginations of the great Davids of the field. 15 Tales by David Weber, David Drake, Gregory Benford, and David Brin. David B. Coe, D.J. Butler, Dave Butler. Avram Davidson, David H. Keller, and many more Davids, including the artist of the cover, who is David Mattingly. The Chronicles of Davids, edited by David F. Sharirod. Stellaris, People of the Stars, edited by Les Johnson and Robert E. Hampson. And 1636, The China Venture, by Eric Flint and Ivor P. Cooper, are all available at booksellers everywhere. I want to welcome Christopher Ruocchio back to the podcast. Hello, Christopher.
Hey, Tony. Thanks for having me.
Christopher Ruocchio is the author of the Sun Eater space fantasy series, and this one's from Baen Books. However, Christopher is assistant editor here at Baen, so we are going to make sure he's on this show as well. He began writing when he was 8 years old and sold his first novel, Empire of Silence, when he was 9. At 22.
Yeah, same difference.
Yeah. He's also assistant editor here at Baen Books. Just generally, he does the social media. You know all kind of stuff here, Christopher. You're just like Mr.
Just whatever they tell me to do.
Yeah.
More or less.
For instance, he and I edited the book
Star Destroyers.
Star Destroyers.
Yeah, we're doing another one coming up called World Breakers. It's going to be about AI smart tanks. Working on that
cool.
next year.
And you've been doing a bunch of editing with Hank Davis on some of those anthologies, those reprint anthologies.
Yeah, done 2 of them now, working on the 3rd here.
So, he's a graduate of North Carolina State University, where he received a degree in English rhetoric and the classics. Out now at booksellers everywhere is The Howling Dark by Christopher Ruocchio. This is book 2 in the Sun Eater series, which continues the star-spanning odyssey of Hadrian Marlowe, a nobleman of the huge human Solon Empire. And his quest is to try to stop a terrible war between humans and the alien Cielsen. So this is just like a star-spanning, really big space opera, space fantasy book. It's really good, very complex, but at the same time, a lot of great characterization, a lot of wonderful action scenes. At one point, Hadrian, your main character, and then the thing is written in first person from Hadrian's point of view, right? All the books are going to be.
Yes, yeah, all 5.
He brings up the Solon Empire. It's the ruler. The emperor is a ruler of over 500 million planets. So this is a big empire. Can you tell us about the setup of your world building, how it functions, how the empire functions, and where is Hadrian, our main character, in the scheme of things?
Yeah, so the Solon Empire of Hadrian's day is about 20,000 years in our future, and the humanity spread about across a third of our galaxy, give or take. Most of those planets are barely settled. There are only a couple hundred people on some of them, mining colonies, that sort of thing. But they still count. But they've spread out from the outer rim all the way in the Perseus arm, right? Because the Milky Way's got a bunch of different arms, and rather than just spread along them, eventually it becomes advantageous to jump across one of the big empty spaces to the next arm. So Perseus on the outside, and then Orion, which is where we are, just on the inside of that, and then moving in towards the core, they've been expanding across a couple of the other arms of the galaxy. And they're just brushing into the core regions now when the story starts. So it's sort of built this huge wedge across the galaxy, moving steadily towards galactic north through the core, which is when they finally encountered the first alien race, the Cielsen, who've ever been technologically advanced enough to stand up to us. Because it's, of course, pretty quiet up there. If you talk to any radio astronomers, we haven't found anything. And so in Hadrian's day, we found a lot of less advanced forms of life, a lot of animal life, a couple things that are intelligent, some things that might questionably be intelligent, but nothing that was, able to fly around and, fire ray guns back at us, that sort of thing. And so when the story opens, the Empire is the biggest by far of a few human states that's finally encountered this, alien opposition, and this has been a huge paradigm shift for everybody, and the aliens have been pretty rapacious in fighting back. They're carnivorous and space-dwelling, so they don't actually... The only things they can really eat that they aren't growing on their own ships are us anyway, and they need to eat, so they've been fighting us for food, basically. As for Hadrian himself, he's a nobleman. The empire is very genetically stratified. He's from the uppermost class. He's a Palatine. His family is distantly related to the emperor and has this very ancient genetic pedigree, can live for like 800 years. He's got he's a little bit stronger than everyone. He's a little bit faster, a little bit taller. Nothing, Kryptonian, but a little bit more advanced. But he is disgraced. By the time book 2 starts, his father has disowned him because he has run away. He did not want to take his father's career choice for him, which was to be an inquisitor in the chantry, which is this religious institution we'll get into. And he has been he was too interested in these aliens and the questions of life out there and what's, he's sort of a soft sort of nerdy kid, and he wanted to learn about them, and his father wasn't into that. And so when book 2 picks up, he has found himself accidentally invested with a bunch of mercenaries trying to make peace with these aliens.
So tell us, before we get into that, maybe a little of the history of the Empire and why it's so. There's just genetic engineering, and there's some castes and such, but there's also a real phobia and hatred of machine enhancement and AIs and things. What has gone on in the past that's led to this? What's the historical curve? I know it's 20,000 years old, so we can't go through all of it. But
yeah, well, very briefly, the reason the Empire is so technophobic, in much the same way that Dune's pretty technophobic, and there are other science fiction series that are like that, is because about 20,000 years before Hadrian's Day, a couple hundred years from ours, AI started to run everything, and that caused a whole bunch of problems. And without being too specific, just because a lot of this figures in the later books in one way or another, the Earth was conquered by a distant past America, our future, who began using AI to regulate everything. And this ended up, getting worse and worse and worse as they started to colonize outer planets. And there were basically no people who weren't completely under the control of these huge, AI systems. And there wasn't really a lot of room for humanity in that future, because as we start seeing increased, mechanization in our own day, there are more and more people who are put out of work, disenfranchised in various ways. Technology doesn't leave a lot of room for stories with people in it. And in writing, I wanted to tell a story about people, because stories that aren't about people aren't really stories. And so I needed a distant future that looked like something we could recognize. And to do that, I had to get rid of the crazy, god, or at least marginalize, so to speak, the godlike AI, crazy science stuff, so we can still tell a story about human beings. And so there's a huge war to get rid of the AI and to purge them from the, early galactic settlements, places like Alpha Centauri, Arcturus, near to Earth. And to replace them with a system that was very deliberately human-centered in cultivating this empire. There are a lot of Roman influences, a lot of Byzantine, and a lot of Qing Chinese influences in the way this thing's structured, with this very legalist system of corporal punishment, things like that. And it's done that way on purpose. Like in universe, the actual empire is deliberately aping these ancient systems to generate a culture that is steeped in these deeply human ways of doing things. Now, a lot of those are medieval, and some of us today might call them backwards, but they are deliberately designed to preserve humanity as a species and as a set of individual organisms.
And they kind of misremember some of the history too, right? I mean,
it's
so ancient that they. I mean, at one point they talk about King Churchill.
Oh yeah. That's really fun to do that sort of thing. Writing, obviously we know better, right? So you get all these little misrememberings. There's a reference, I think, in the first book to what might be Star Wars, but they're remembering it as something that's actually historical, because all these things get blurred together. My favorite one, and nobody has ever mentioned this to me on social media, is there's a religion about Sid Arthur, right? So it's a corruption of Arthurian myth and Buddhism. And so they talk about, Buddha meditated under a tree, and in some versions of the Arthur story, Merlin is trapped in a tree. So Arthur is learning how to be Arthur from Merlin, who's trapped in a tree, and that's where he gets enlightenment like the Buddha. And so there are all these things that get a little plasticed together like that. And there are things that are remembered straight up. The people can still quote Shakespeare because some of the texts are still around, and some people, the more educated people, know better than others, but a lot of it's gotten muddied together, which lets me, play with things, because sometimes I'll misremember a quote, and the misremembered version of the quote is more useful for my purposes as a writer, right, than the actual ones. So I'll just put it in wrong, and someone will call me on it, and I'll be like, yeah, but it's been 20,000 years. Gotcha. Which is fun to do.
I feel safe. Yeah, that's fun. Also how conspiracy theories work.
It is, but I'm not telling anyone this is true. So I'm not Alex Jones. I get off free.
I see. Well, it's pretty convincing, nevertheless. You mentioned the chantry before. So this is a term that Hadrian uses a lot.
Yes.
What is their? They're related to Earth also in some way, right?
Yeah. So the chantry is the organized state religion of the empire. It was started as a propaganda program, like 10,000 years before Hadrian's time, in a way to sort of centralize, because it's hard, right, to run an empire of so many, million planets. So you need a really strong philosophical thing that draws everyone together, and religion's super good for this. And this is kind of a cynical attitude. I'm, fairly religious myself, but not all religions are made equal, and this one is definitely a fake one. And it's this sort of, neo-pagan Earth cult. They worship Earth, which is gone. It was the casualty in this war against the machines, and destroying it was the final act that liberated humanity from the machines. And so we did kill our own home world in order to become free from machine control. And that's still had a 20,000 year hangover in everyone's cultural memory. And the chantry, because in Christianity, a chantry is a church that you set up. If you're a wealthy person, you'll endow it, you'll pay for it, so that people will say whichever prayers you want. Like if you're, like you would, get a college building named after you. There are chantries on Oxford campus where people who were rich would build a chapel for the school, and people would pay money so that, for the repose of their souls, in the hereafter. And so this is a building, an institution that's been set up to pray for the soul of the earth, right? Because maybe the earth will come again. We will be able to return home and all of these things. Now, whether or not the earth is ever going to be in fit state for habitation again is a separate question. But it's turned into this system for, and a lot of peasants will sincerely believe this, but it's turned into a system for centralizing, cultural touchstones across all these planets. But it's also the judicial system, right? They're the people who check for resurgent machines, right? Make sure nobody has been dabbling with AI technology or has been integrating machinery into their own bodies. These things are very taboo because they're trying to prevent a second situation where the AI take over everything and try to wipe humanity out. And so they go on inquisitions and they look for witches, and only these witches are people who have machine implants or might be operating, anything that resembles artificial intelligence.
Well, one other thing about the world before we get into the story is, how does star travel work, and what are the limitations and such?
So I am not a physics student, like you said. I was a classics major. I studied Latin. I read all the old Greek stuff translated because Greek is hard. And so I don't have a head for all the general relativity stuff, but I knew I wanted this big sprawling sort of Star Wars scale giant universe. And hyperspace is too hokey because it has no rules at all. And it's so fast, that you may as well be next door to everything, which always bothered me. I love Star Wars, but that always bothered me. And so there are warp drives, but they're slow. There's no time dilation in play when you're using a warp drive because you're not really moving, right? You're just moving space, like you do in Star Trek. But if you want to get somewhere, it's going to take months or years or decades, which has a way of, which makes managing the empire very difficult. They have a lot of localized regional governors. They can communicate instantaneously using like an Ansible, right? Like an Orson Scott Card, Ursula Le Guin Ansible, faster than light. But they can't travel anywhere quickly. So it might take 10, 20 years. So when this book starts, it's actually been 50 years since book 2, but it's only been about 10 for Hadrian because he spent most of that time frozen. And there are a lot of these really protracted gaps like that between the books because each story is kind of its own, arc. You could read book 2 first and maybe be a bit lost, but the story would at least make sense. Because there are these huge time steps between books and things, and even inside the books as they travel from place to place, which makes logistics really complicated, but not too complicated because I'm not worrying about people aging at different rates, right? If I were working with general relativity, or is that special relativity? I get them backwards.
But people can get separated if they're on different
yes
mission tracks, and age because they wake up at different times,
Yes,
and the travel takes different amounts of time.
So a lot of Hadrian's people will be frozen longer than he is. He'll keep certain of his friends on ice until he needs them throughout the story. Or if they're from lower castes, they'll only live for like 80 years like you and me, and not Hadrian's 800, right? So his friend, when we meet his friend Switch at the beginning of this book, he looks like he's about 40, he's pushing middle-aged, and he was like 18 in book 1. So he's been up a lot in the intervening time period here, and it's worn on him a lot more than it has on Hadrian, who at 35 is basically 20. And will continue to look like that for another several decades, especially if he spends a lot of time frozen. So people's ages tend to drift, and it's hard to keep track of, how old characters might be relative to one another. But it ends up, a lot of sailors, when they sign up for the army, say, no, they're never coming home, because they'll be out for, by the time they get home, their great-great-great-grandkids will be there.
So what happened in the first book in Empire of Silence? Sort of give us a short précis and tell us where we are at the start of the Howling Wind.
Well, super briefly, Hadrian is a nobleman who runs away from home early on, like I said, because of the torture thing. He didn't want to be an inquisitor. And
he would also have had to have owned slaves or something like that, right? That's because there's slavery in the empire.
Yeah, he would have had to do a lot of things he wouldn't have been comfortable with, torturing people, dealing with the uglier side of things. Yeah, owning slaves, all sorts of things. To be an inquisitor is a tough job, because you have to, if there's any hint of this high technology, like very frequently, if they think there's an actual AI problem, they'll just nuke an entire planet. They'll glass cities and things. Just, it's not worth messing with, because really, humanity was almost done in ancient history, and they don't want to repeat that. So he runs away from home, and the ship he's on doesn't get him where he thought he was going. He's taken to a different planet through mysterious circumstances, things that get touched on a little bit in this one, by almost cosmic accident. He ends up middle of nowhere, marooned, robbed, and left with nothing. He spends some time on the streets, sort of like an Aladdin, right? And then he ends up fighting in Colosseum as a gladiator. He sells himself in there in order to get some money. He's trying to buy his own ship so he can get back to where he's supposed to be, and make some new friends along the way. But the planet he's on gets attacked by the Sea Elfin, and he has by then worked his way into the court of the local nobleman. As a translator, is teaching his kids, the nobleman's kids, foreign languages, because Hadrian, as a kid, had learned a lot of different languages, including the alien one, because he has a talent for them and an interest in them, and he wanted to be a scholar and a diplomat, and it didn't really work out. So he's working as a tutor, and he gets wrapped up in this invasion, and is the first person who manages to negotiate a surrender on the part of the aliens. Because the aliens, like the Japanese in World War II, just do not surrender, right? They will fight to the end. They will kill themselves if you catch them. But he manages to negotiate a surrender, which is completely unprecedented, and he interrogates them, and he learns that the aliens have met humans before, and they've actually had dealings with them, which, as far as anyone in the Empire knows, is also unprecedented. And it turns out that they have been dealing with the Extrasolarians, who are a group of humans who live between the stars. They're kind of like off the grid, So they hide out on, random asteroids, rogue planets, around brown dwarfs, places that real civilization's not interested in being because the resources are too scarce. But at least out there, they're free of imperial and chantry oversight, right? And so those guys are perfectly willing to deal with the man-eating, aliens, because why not? Who's going to stop him? And so they, when this book starts, are trying to track down this planet called Vorgosos, which was sort of like part Atlantis, part Tortuga, like pirate den, right? And they're trying to find a way to contact the Sea Elfin, because the Sea Elfin are nomadic, and so they need to go somewhere to meet someone who knows how to contact them, because they've got no idea. And that's where we find book 2.
Yeah, so tell us about the Sea Elfin. Right there's a war going on right now. They don't live on planets, like you say, and they are rapacious, and they're really alien in their ways. What's the threat to empire, and what's going on in general?
The Cielsen travel in these migratory clusters, and some of their ships are almost planet-sized, right? They hollow out asteroids and moons, and they live in those because they were originally subterranean when they evolved. So it's a lot of work to just go on a new planet. You got to deal with sunlight and all these conditions, and so it's a perfectly reasonable thing to do is just to hollow out these giant, rocks in space and live in those. And they are carnivorous exclusively. They don't eat anything that's not really meat. And we happen to be made of the right kind of protein. And so they are mostly interested in what they'll do is they'll find a planet and they'll invade it, right? They'll land people, they'll land troops on it. And they'll start rounding people up like cattle, and then they'll boost them back into their ships, and they'll eat them. They'll use them as slave labor for a while, and then they'll eat them. It's not that they're not civilized. They have a rich artistic tradition, warrior culture. They have a really stratified society that's like even more than the empire is, right? They're like almost a parody of human hierarchies, because there's the minute that Cielsen loses a power exchange, right, a fight or whatever, they will obey the other one forever. They'll probably resent them, but they're deeply, deeply obedient. And so they live in these, like every Cielsen who's not a prince is owned by another one, and there's a huge pyramid of this. People will be owned sometimes. A Cielsen will be owned back and forth by different ones, or their master will be owned by someone else, and it all trickles up to the clan head, the Aita. And each one of these clans under an Aita roves around basically doing its own thing, and will farm whatever they can find. And they discovered humanity as we move towards the core, and that's been an extremely attractive food source for them ever since. And they've spent hundreds of years now picking off our colonies, not really with any grand strategy, but they've been really hungry because now they have this hugely static available food source. There are a lot of us on any individual planet. They can really, really grow now, and so they're hitting this huge expansion phase because they finally found more food than they thought they'd ever find. They're not starving in the dark anymore, eating one another and whatever few things they've they raise for food on their ships.
So tell us about at the beginning, at least the first portion of the book. The main Cielsen character is Tanarin Iakato. Who is he? What is Hadrian hoping to accomplish with this thing?
So Tanarin is what's called a Baitan, and because the Cielsen clans are so they're so based on like physical violence as a way for determining who's in charge, tend to shift a lot. Clans are not very static. They have to build a lot of protectors around the princes to keep them, safe. And so they're not really Cielsen dynasties. They have singular strong leaders who get wiped out by another singular strong leader. And it's very unusual that any one of them pass on their rulership to their kid, right? Because you see this with humans too, right? Most dynasties crumble in a couple generations because, although it's a bad example because the Roman dynasties are usually adoptive, but Augustus was great. But by the time you get through the end of Julius Caesar's family, you've got Nero, who's useless, right? Terrible emperor. And the Cielsen have this problem. The Baitan protect the integrity of the tribe's history. Baitan means root, so they're like the roots of the tribe, right? And Tanarin is interested in the cultural and the religious history of its people, and it's one of the people who protects the tribal legacy of the Otiolo clan, who are the Cielsen we see in Book 2. And it had gone, when they invaded the planet Hadrian was on in Book 1, they were trying to go on pilgrimage to this religious site that was built by another ancient alien power that has left ruins all over the galaxy that the Cielsen worship, among other things. They don't just worship them. And so it was trying to learn more about these ancient aliens as well, because the Cielsen have a deep and complicated relationship with these other vanished alien ruins, which we'll get into in the later books.
Hadrian has basically he's got this guy hostage, although he's agreed to go with him.
Yes.
Tannerin, and he's hoping to negotiate some kind of truce with that particular clan
Yes.
at least, and maybe start something with the other Sealson clans. How is he going to do that? Does he have any idea of how he could?
Hadrian has a really bad habit of rushing into things before he's really thought things through, especially early on in his life. He's very impulsive. One of my friends is a Catholic theologian, and he was really complaining about Hadrian's lack of canonical virtues because he's not prudent, Christopher. So Hadrian has this pie-in-the-sky notion that if he can get the aliens to sit down, he can reason with them, because reason is reason, right? And we can talk it out. And so he negotiates the surrender in Book 1, which has never happened before. So he's a little high on himself, and he thinks, well, I've got this priest of the Sealson who is loyal to this prince. I use him as a hostage. It's agreed to work as a hostage so that I don't kill it and I don't kill its people. Maybe we can change something because the war has gone on for too long.
And the Sealson also just wipe out whole worlds.
Oh yeah, no, they'll land and they will branch us to death. And that needs to stop, because we'll lose people by the million, right, every time they're hungry, because they have huge populations in these ships, millions themselves, and a person's a lot of food, but that's going to feed one Sealson for a week, right, 2 weeks maybe.
And they're also, they're good at fighting, and so they're a match for the Empire when the Empire comes up against them.
Oh, big time. And they're also a lot bigger than us personally. They're like 8 feet tall as a rule, and they have claws and can see in the dark, and are pretty keen fighters. And they happen to use a kind of weapon. It's a drone that they sort of throw, and it flies through the air, and it'll drill through armor, which is perfect for bypassing human force fields, which, like the ones in Dune, have a speed limit. Right, so they're able, because you don't want to fire guns on spaceships, right? Because God knows what you're going to hit. So they use these drones instead, and so they tend to be absolutely formidable in combat on just several fronts.
All right, and so the Sealson worship or revere this alien race, the Quiet.
So yeah. This is actually something I haven't gotten to talk much about, because none of the reviews people post seem to want to touch any of this just yet, because it's been very vague. But the galaxy that the Solid Empire is in, our galaxy, is full of all sorts of ancient ruins. Now, it took us a long time to start noticing them, because there aren't very many close to Earth. But as you start to move towards the core of the galaxy, and as you widen out your search, you find all these things. And a lot of them seem to be built by the same species. There are these very mysterious ruins. There's not much in them. They're almost completely empty. It's just black stone labyrinths with these strange circular rune marks in the walls, right? They look kind of like if you got a agglomeration of bubbles, right? Just sort of linked together all over the walls, everywhere. And they're on dozens of worlds. There's no, pottery. There's no artwork. There are no bodies. There's nothing to connect these things, but they're everywhere. And it is quite possible, Hadrian theorizes, and Tannerin slightly hints at, that there are some of these ruins on the Sealson homeworld, and the Sealson evolved in the shadow of these ruins, because they grew up underground, right? So they might have evolved in one of these labyrinths. By no means are these the only ancient ruins in the galaxy. There are a couple other things get hinted at in Book 2. There are these strange oceans full of sort of sentient microorganisms, and other things like that, which might not have been built by the Quiet. But these ruins are relatively common compared to some of these other unique things. So they seems like there was this ancient civilization that dominated at least a reasonable portion of the galaxy a very long time ago, and that they are no longer around, and that they have left very little but these enduring ruins. And Tannerin is deeply interested in researching them for reasons that Hadrian does not quite understand. He believes that they worship them like gods, because Hadrian tends to think, and the humans tend to think generally, the Sealson are very primitive. They sort of look down their noses at them as beasts, which, they do eat people, which is frightening, but there may be more going on there. And they may not be the only things that the Sealson worship either. And I can't really say too much more about that because book 3 is going to go into this a great deal.
Well, all right. So we open. Hadrian's coming out of this cryo sleep called the fugue. He's actually not going to go down to Rostrum yet. He's going to go to a market space station thing to find out where he can. He's ultimately trying to find this world. What's it called?
Vorgosis.
Vorgosa.
Yeah, so when the book opens, they've been on the trail for several years, right? And they finally gotten a lead. There is an arms dealer on this planet called Rustam that has apparently had dealings with Vorgosis, might have come from there, and they're going to meet with him. It's called the Painted Man, and maybe be able to work out some sort of deal, get some information, right? Very like we got to deal with smugglers, the seedy parts of the galaxy. The city is really cool. I don't remember where I got the idea, but it's a refugee camp because the capital on this planet had been hit by the Cielson and just burned off the map. There's a giant crater there. And so what refugees are left, in order to get a city up that could accommodate them quickly, they landed every giant space tanker they could find, and they built in the, gutted out remains of these, multi-mile long, space freighters.
Yeah, and that's really good. And they're never going to go up again.
Yeah, they can't go up again because
they weren't even built to land.
The ships are too big, right? Because if you're building something in 0G, you don't have to build it, with gravity in mind, right? So you land those things, all sorts of spars are going to crack under their own weight and things. So the city's all crooked and fallen into place, and it's. Well, I just thought it would be kind of a cool, different kind of. As I didn't want every planet we went to just be the same, regular old city. I figured, something mix it up a little bit. Yes. This also let us see some of the cost of the fighting. It also, go ahead.
Frankly, it kind of reminded me of Blade Runner.
It was meant to. It was meant to. You know full well that I am a big Blade Runner fan, and a lot of what I do in my writing is, I really want to respect the traditions, the touchstones of the genre, and some people feel like that's ripping off or being too on the nose, and I understand where they're coming from, but in blending all of these references, these notes. And this is not anything that's unusual in literature by any means. You see things like this in the way that, like, stories from the Middle Ages, like the story of Saint Barlaam is just the Buddha story that had migrated into European culture, right? You see people rearticulate stories from Greek legend as Christianized ones in the Middle Ages. You see things reborrowed in King Arthur and stuff like this. And you see Easter eggs in everything, Ready Player One is a book composed of Easter eggs. Nobody accuses Ernest Cline of ripping things off, right? And what I want to do...
Oh, I don't know about that.
Well, it's not like, he plagiarized the Goonies. Well, referencing the Goonies isn't,
Yeah.
But what I want to do is write a book that honors a lot of these, pillars of science fiction as a genre, because I'm a fan. I grew up reading all these things, watching these movies, and I want to write for people who are like me, people who love all of these things, and maybe miss them,
Yeah. Well, we should talk about your influences, maybe in a moment.
Sure.
But you've already referenced Dune and Star Wars, and there's a huge Star Wars influence here too. I detect.
Yeah. Hopefully in the best possible way.
Yeah. It's like a Star Wars empire that makes sense. And
I do my best.
There's a lot of And also, when we talk about the very cool swords they have, we can.
We'll get there.
All right, so Hadrian's down on this planet. He's looking for the Painted Man. And we are on the edge of Empire, outside of Empire at this point.
Yes.
Right? This is where the humans who don't mind having machines being part of them or wholly of them are. The Painted Man is a homunculus. First of all, why is Hadrian looking for him, and what is that, and what are those creepy SOMs that are around him?
Yeah, so he's looking for the Painted Man just because he's a weapons dealer who's got links to Vorgosis, right? So this is just where we start. We gotta find this guy. He's got a link. We're gonna follow it.
Because they're looking for Vorgosis, this planet, because nobody knows how to get there.
Right, it's missing. Yeah, it's a lost planet. Everyone's heard of it in stories. Most people don't believe it's real, but apparently this guy knows. And Hadrian's just the sort of romantic who would believe stories about lost planets anyway, and very, very occasionally, these sorts of stories are true. But he's what's called a homunculus, and a homunculi are they're artificial people. Some of them are crafted to specific purposes. There are some called dryads. One of Hadrian's crewmen is a dryad. She has been genetically engineered to make her own food with chlorophyll, like plants, right? So some of them have these strange mutations. The Painted Man...
Her name is Ilex, right?
Ilex, yeah. She's named... Yeah.
Isn't that Latin for holly?
Oak.
Oak.
Yes, she's named after oak trees. Exactly, because she's a dryad. So the Painted Man is a shapeshifter. He has chromatophores in his skin that allow him to change their pigmentation, which he can use not only to just change how tan he is, but also to generate tattoos and all sorts of birthmarks, that sort of thing, so they can imitate people very precisely, change voices, this sort of thing. They're used obviously as spies. They're used as assassins. They're used sometimes as courtesans for the weirder people in the galaxy. The Painted Man in question is a weapons dealer, and so he is this artificial person who has escaped from his upbringing, because of course he was designed by somebody for a purpose, and is just living his life as a criminal. And as for the SOMs, the Psalms, a Psalm is a human being who has had tech, kit put into his head to basically make him like a drone soldier, right? So the Painted Man, as this person from beyond the Empire, is perfectly comfortable getting a bunch of people, jamming machines in their heads, and using them as slaves, basically. So he's got his own little private army of remote control soldiers. Obviously, if the Chantry got wind of this, they would nuke the place from orbit and be done with it. It's the only way to be sure. Aliens. And but they haven't, because we are out beyond the ambit of Imperial control, because the galaxy is just too big to enforce everything, and there are always cracks.
So, now you call some of these machine-modified folks the Exalted. What does that mean?
Yeah, so... of all these extra Solarians, right, the people who live beyond the Empire's, control, there's a subcategory called the Exalted. And the Exalted are very full of themselves, which is why they call themselves that, but they are sort of post-human. They have either genetically modified themselves or mechanically modified themselves to the point where they're not really even human anymore. Hadrian meets one kid in this named Nazareno. Nazareno is literally just a brain in like a little globe that's got a bunch of tentacles, because Nazareno is... a cabin boy, basically, on this giant spaceship, and in order to operate in zero-G, it's far more convenient for him to be a little globe with a bunch of machine arms and tentacles to grab onto things. So he's given up his body completely, and this is like a 14-year-old kid, so it's kind of messed up. And the extras, or rather the Exalted, will all basically modify themselves in whichever way they feel like. They'll graft new arms onto themselves. They will, replace, whole organs. They'll put their body in a giant mechanical crab. They'll clone themselves. They'll change their body so they've got 4 legs or can breathe underwater. But they'll do this to themselves after they're born, whatever they're born like, as opposed to a homunculus, which is someone who's grown to a task, right? Okay. There are these very weird specific distinctions these people have come up with over all this time, but the Exalted tend basically not to be seen because they live on these giant spaceships and they travel around between the stars, and they try to have as little to do with the Empire as possible because, of course, being as modified as they are, that is a prime target for Inquisition justice. And they don't want to get got, right?
Yeah. Well, one of the giant spaceships is the Enigma of Hours, which I think is a great name for a spaceship.
Thank you.
And the captain, I guess he's sort of like one of these crab
Yeah,
He's
yeah.
8 feet long, or
We don't
I don't
see.
even know what he looks like.
Yeah, we don't see the captain of the Enigma in the book. But yeah, the crew of these they crew these huge ships called Sojourners, and the Sojourners are these massive vessels that are used for interstellar trading by these extrasolarians, because they are extremely advanced, they're extremely dark, they're extremely hard to find, and so it's a lot easier for them to just bundle all together and use them kind of as mobile cities, bases that are run by these very eccentric machine crews, in order to escape from the Empire. Yeah. And so they end up chartering passage on one of these ships, the Enigma, in order to get to Vorgosus, because the Exalted mostly all know where Vorgosus is, because Vorgosus is one of these, mecca destinations for the extrasolarians, for all of these sort of unseemly characters who live between the cracks of the Empire.
Yeah, and I mean, the ruler of Vorgosus is kind of the most modified of the modified.
Yes, yes, he is.
So, Vorgosus, I mean, we don't want to get too spoilery, but it does exist, and it's ruled by this immortal decadent being named Karn Sagara. Tell us about him and his golems, and he's just a great character, and he pervades the book, so it's important to talk about him a little bit.
Yeah, so Karn is the Dark Lord of Vorgosus. He has lived for about as long as there's been an empire, about 15,000 years. He grew up in the shadow of the war to defeat the machines, and as a child, he'd been abducted by the early Exalted, right? They raided one of his planets as this war was going, because the Exalted are descended from some of these machine-adjacent humans that the Empire was fighting very, very distantly. And they were still raiding planets after the war was over, because we did wipe out most of the, the machines. But there are always cracks, right? And so they disappeared, right? And Vorgosus is one of the old fortresses that they used during that first war. And Karn was victimized by these people, but managed, because he's very clever, to take control of Vorgosus a long, long time ago. And ever since, he has ruled with an iron fist, and has been using all sorts of ancient machine technology on the planet in order to extend his own life by cloning himself and moving into his clones, and by slowly building out more and more of himself into the computer systems that surround him. So he's not really just a person anymore. But he lives, in individual bodies, some of which will be different from incarnation to incarnation, because he has gotten bored in all of his living and starts to experiment, right? Sometimes he's, female, sometimes he's male, sometimes he's neither, sometimes he's all machine. He'll look different depending, but always, moving one body to the next. And he has mostly turned inwards by the time Hadrian meets him. He's very interested in art and culture, and he spends enormous amounts of time, like hundreds of hours, sitting in absolute silence thinking about things, because he's so old, he's not really human anymore. And he's built this huge, fabulous city around him, which is mostly empty, that he lives in by himself, with himself. And he makes his name and he makes his money by offering the same sort of life extension to the rich and the powerful of the galaxy. Even certain imperial nobles will sometimes find their way to Vorgosus and will make a deal with him, whatever that deal may be, in order to get a second youth, right? So certain of these imperial nobles might be their own parents masquerading as a second generation, right? They all have passed on into their air quotes children and have been ruling for a whole second life.
Super creepy. So, and he knows he's in contact with some of the Cielsen as well, which is why Hadrian wanted to come.
Karn will deal with everything. He's aware there are these things that are, the Cielsen, the quiet, these ancient aliens. There are deeper mysteries in the galaxy that humanity has not even quite expanded out to find yet, that Karn has known about for thousands of years, because he is exactly the sort of person who would look for that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, before we leave Karn, I just loved I talked about this with you earlier, the Kubla Khan, the poem by Coleridge references here. the caves of ice, the gardens, the pleasure gardens. He's built this wonderful edifice, and it seems to me like you took that poem and said, "What if this was literally true? All this stuff from this poem."
Yeah, so I'm a big romantic poetry guy. I don't know, Keats, Byron, Coleridge, the whole run. I got into them, maybe midway through college. I don't remember why. But Coleridge's Kubla Khan is this great poem, right, about the palace of Xanadu that Kubla Khan built, that Marco Polo saw, and it's unfinished. But it's this extremely evocative piece. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. And so I built Vorgoses around the shape of the palace described in the poem, right? There is a sunless sea at the bottom, right? And there are things in it. And there is a river that runs down to it through the old city, from the ice, the surface of the planet, right, all the way down. Because we are going down towards the core of the planet. It's all subterranean because this planet has no sun. It's frozen over in the middle of nowhere, the dark of space. And there's this, fabulous garden because Karn collects, he doesn't just collect art, he collects plants, he collects animals, just all sorts of curiosities because he's lived for so long. And curiosity is kind of the only thing that can keep you going for 15,000 years. And so he's built this fabulous, place, and he's this, this sort of terrifying warlord, much like Kubla Khan, who was kind of a contradiction, right? Terrifying warlord, but, sort of, I can't think of the word, but, he had a passion for, the arts and beauty and this sort of thing. And that kind of contradiction in people is really interesting to me. And so, why not do that in space?
Yeah, and it is one of the ways that Hadrian is able to intrigue him as well.
Yeah, well, Hadrian's a really, artsy kind of guy himself. He's very interested in history and poetry and in art itself. And so they're able to, even though Hadrian is, he's a kid, an infant compared to Karn finds him vaguely interesting because they have these things in common. And so I am kind of setting them up as this sort of, opposing forces, right? They've got a lot in common, but... one of them's septic.
One thing I did want to bring in is that Hadrian, aside from being a sweet-souled fellow, also is a pretty dang good sword fighter.
Yes.
And he fights with this sword made of high metal. How do those work, and how is it different from a lightsaber?
So... as a big Star Wars fan, but a big Star Wars fan whose dad was an engineer, I was repeatedly told that lightsabers were stupid as a child, and it always annoyed me. But he was right? If you play with a flashlight, right, if you've got a sword that's made out of light or even plasma, it doesn't weigh anything, right? And so if you're playing with a flashlight, you got the beam on, you're going to run that beam across your arm, across your face 1 billion times while you're twirling it, because there's no mass there, so you're not aware of the dangerous thing you're wielding. Star Wars answer is always, they're using the Force so they don't hurt themselves. But that's not good enough. I was a junior Olympic fencer. I mean, I went to the, let's be clear, I went to the qualifiers. I got through 2 rounds, but I was, compared to most human beings, that's a pretty good sword fighter. I did HEMA for a little while, and I know a fair bit about sword fighting. I'm not by any means an expert. I'm not like one of, Hank Reinhardt's people or anything. But I know enough to know that my dad was right. And so high matter is this material. It's kind of like quicksilver. It's a pretty heavy liquid metal that can be programmed to do various things. It's used in a lot of electronics, things like that. But one of its more decadent functions is as blade material. Because being liquid, you can program the edge really, really fine, so it's actually possible for it to cut between molecules, right? And so it can cut virtually anything that's not got huge molecules, right? Long chain diamond, like carbon molecules, you can't cut those because molecular bonds are real tough. But it'll cut through flesh, no problem, stone, steel, whatever you want. But it still has the mass, so it's a lot safer to use than a lightsaber is. But that being said, it's still cutting through virtually everything. So it changes a lot of the ways the sword fighting works. I had to think about that a lot. Because if you can just cut through anything, you can't do a lot of sword moves that will require, pressure on the blade or things like that. Because as soon as that blade detects pressure, the high matter will turn into a sharp edge, right? So it'll cut in any direction it wants, right? You can do a lot of weird moves with that too that you can't do with normal swords, right? And it takes virtually no force to use, so it changes the way people fight. But Hadrian's grown up fighting. He was a gladiator after he was, he was tutored as a kid because he was a nobleman and he was a gladiator. And so, when he's not quoting poetry, he's cutting things to pieces. And I was a little unfair in book one. There wasn't a lot of sword action because he hadn't gotten a sword. He was destitute most of the book. And so I gave him one in the last chapter of book one, which is, a kind of a promissory note. I swear I'm going to use this damn thing in book two. And so things get cut to pieces about every damn page if I can help it.
And when other characters have a high metal sword, then you can have a sword fight.
Yes, so
it's very dangerous.
Yeah, so there are two high matter sword fights in this one. I won't say against whom, but high matter can't cut through itself because it's liquid. Also, it wouldn't be cool if they could. There's a strong. You have to use a strong magnetic field to hold it in place, and so they repel one another. Maybe it's magnetic. I don't know. I haven't thought about details. It's magic, space magic.
Yeah. Well, it's pretty cool, and the way you describe it is cool and expert. So, tell us a little bit about Hadrian's companions. Some of them are boon companions, and some are not so boon companions. Maybe tell us about the love triangle that we see at the beginning. And I guess it's not really a love triangle.
No, it's just two separate lines. So book one, Hadrian meets this archaeologist who's very interested in these quiet ruins, because there are quiet ruins in book one, named Valka. And Valka is from this other nation out in space, the Demarchy of Tavros. So they've got a social credit system like China. They don't, everything's very government controlled, very, top-down socialist authoritarian. And she loves it, right? She thinks the empire is this backwards, terrible medieval state, and, doesn't have patience for it, doesn't like Hadrian's backwards sort of traditionalism, any of that sort of thing. And they don't really, get along philosophically, but they both share this interest in history, right? And so Hadrian's, all over her, really liked her, but she was like, I've got no time for you. So when book two starts, I play a really mean trick, and Hadrian's ended up with a comparably minor character from book one. And I knew when I was writing it, I was like, it's not a nice trick. People are going to be mad at me. And I have gotten a couple of reviews who were a little pissed off about that. And Genon is a soldier from another nation called Jad, which is kind of like a sort of Persian warring city-states kind of place. And they've joined up with Hadrian's little force because he's got this really, team of misfits company working here. He's got some ex-gladiators. He's got some Judean soldiers who've been gifted them by the Judean government as part of this little expedition. They've got some Norman mercenaries, and he's got some imperial soldiers, and they're all trying to get together, work together, and it's not working. But he ended up with her because of some events that happened between the books. And he knows when they get orders pretty early in the book to abandon the mission because it's taken too long and it's not worth it. And he knows that if he tries to go through with his mission, if he pursues his ideals, he's going to lose her, right? But Valga sticks with him because reaching out to the aliens and making peace is exactly the sort of thing she's into. And so he's sort of pulled between them as he's pulled between his ideals and this sort of, following orders pragmatism.
Yeah.
And he's pulled, camps of friends around him, too, as he loses some friends, too, in addition to a love interest.
And they've been masquerading as a mercenary company, but they sort of become that mercenary company. It's called the Red Company.
Yeah. When they leave Emesh, the planet, at the end of book one, they've been given an official mandate by the Empire, letter of marque, and, you have to go and find this, do what you can. And part of doing that is they have to play the role, right, so that they can deal with criminals and stuff. So they've actually been doing mercenary work in order to build a name and a reputation, exactly so they can talk to somebody like the Painted Man. So they've actually been working together as a unit, and things have sort of, alliances have shifted as all these disparate groups have started to fight together. Some people's loyalties to their nations might now not be primary. They might be more loyal to their fighting companions, which is totally, how that thing happens in war, right? You see stories about, I can't remember if it was, I think it was the Italian army. There was an Italian company, I think, that went to maybe it wasn't Italian, maybe Swiss. Anyway, this one military company went to war in World War II, and they came back with like a new French guy that like decided to just come home with them, right? He wasn't French anymore. He joined them. I don't think it was Italian because that'd be different sides, but you get the idea. And so, relationships shift. And as they've become a more coherent mercenary company, those original relationships sort of break down.
So the one problem that he has is causing a great deal of contention within the group is Basander Lind, who becomes a major character in the book. What's the problem between them?
So Basander is the commander of the Imperial little part of the group, right? And he's nominally in control of the whole mission, but because Hadrian's the one who sort of won over the Judeans in Book 1, and he won over these Norman mercenaries in between Books 1 and 2, and all the gladiators are totally, those are Hadrian's people through and through. People really kind of follow Hadrian and not Basander. Hadrian is the sort of person who'll put himself on the front lines, right? He'll fight with his people in the front, right? Because he doesn't really have a head for strategy, but he's a really good fighter. And he's a pretty inspiring speaker, and he's not an unlikable person. Basander is a by-the-book officer, right? He, follows regulatory code, punishes people when they break rules, right? Gives commands, doesn't, put himself, in the middle of the action because he needs to run things, right? He's a naval captain. And, the world needs people like that. But Basander feels like his authority is being undermined by Hadrian's popularity. And as they've moved further and further away from imperial space, as Hadrian's sort of become more ascendant and popular, this has generated some strain within the company. And of course, when they are told to return, Basander, being a by-the-book soldier, is absolutely in charge of the return, wing of this argument. And as the company fractures, they fracture between Basander and Hadrian. And so that's a real source of tension there.
Yeah. And there's Basander just brings up a lot of Hadrian's uncomfortableness with his position in society and having thrown off his heritage and now coming back to and everything like that.
Yeah, so Basander is, I don't want to say he's, Basander is a traditionalist, right? He's really like I say, he's a paint by the numbers, by the book kind of guy in every possible dimension. Hadrian is a nobleman who disobeyed his father, rejected his birthright, and constantly flouts authority, right? He's like a T. Lawrence sort of, Lord Byron-y, I'm not following your rules, even though he's a product of the system, right? He wants to do his own thing, he has his own vision, and devil take the hindmost, like let's just do, he's going to do his thing. And Basander, thinks that the rules are there for a reason and they need to be followed, and that's how, things really get done. And since Hadrian is the way he is, he kind of represents everything Basander is opposed to philosophically, right, personally. So Basander is, very straight-laced. Hadrian is going to fly by the seat of his pants all the time. And, I have a lot of sympathy for Basander. He's an antagonist, but I understand why people like that are the way they are. And, there's a lot of tension that gets built in as a consequence of that, just because he sees Hadrian as this person who's got all these benefits from the system, right? And he thinks it's a damn good system, and Hadrian doesn't respect them, right?
Yeah. So there's a lot of historical references, a lot of Roman history references here. How was real history an inspiration for you?
Mostly, in terms of trivia, right? Because I'm not a professional historian by any means. My classics background is in literature, right? And so most of the history that I'll learn like an interesting anecdote or something, and then part of the or a detail, right? And part of the work of the fiction writers to put all these things together in a new way. It's 20,000 years out. I don't need the legal system to work exactly like, the Roman 12 tables or exactly like the way the Qing did it. But if I learn an interesting way about these things work, I'll salt that in, knead it, change things around. And so I'll pick up an interesting story or a quote, and I'll be like, wow, that's, and you never know what's going to be useful. So as a writer, you should always be reading. You should really be always reading about real things, because Lord knows what's going to be of use to you, and, inspirational strike, you throw that in some way. Now, I'm a huge, I don't want to say fan of, but, I'm deeply interested in the old Roman Republic and in the Empire and the Byzantines, after, just because, aesthetics, I guess. I always thought they looked cool as a kid, and I just sort of backed into it. I'm Roman Catholic, so, kind of comes with the territory, I suppose. It's in the name. But there are other things, too. The British, the Spanish empires, just all these old periods of history have now, to me, a sort of romance to them. And I know, obviously, it's nothing simple, right? But, the people from those periods, the sorts of stories you hear about people like, Hannibal, or about Scipio and their rivalry, things like that, they filter into the book in weird ways, and some of them more direct than others. Hadrian will quote Marcus Aurelius straight up, right? Or people will, there are centurions in the army instead of sergeants or whatever. Because, like I said, the empire wanted very self-consciously to be a throwback. They wanted all of these sort of anachronistic historical structures built into their system as kind of a thumbing the nose to the machines that almost destroyed them. They're going to embrace tradition and history in its fullest possible way and wear that on their sleeves because we're alive and we're human, right? Which is, all a long time ago, and it's been thousands of years, so that's all very sincere now. They have gladiator matches, these sorts of things. The gladiator stuff is a huge element in Book 1 that's just, borrowed. Because, Roman gladiators weren't, for the most part, slaves. You would sometimes fight prisoners and stuff, but the real gladiators were highly paid athletes, and this is all a plot point in Book 1, things like that.
So, you're a pretty young guy.
Yeah.
Getting older, but still young. Tell us about the genesis. I mean, you must have started this pretty young. What's the genesis of the project? How'd you come to conceive and begin this Sun Eater series?
I've always been writing the same book. It hasn't been the same book because it's changed completely. But since I was 8, we used to play make-believe on the playground, right? And my parents didn't let me watch a lot of TV. I was allowed to read. I was allowed to see the Batman cartoon. Star Wars films, the original 3, because even Phantom Menace, I was the last kid who grew up without the Phantom Menace, and I was allowed TV Land. And so when my friends were like, Christopher, do you want to play Dragon Ball Z? I was like, sure. I don't know what that is. Can I be Batman? And after about 2 weeks of careful deliberation, my fellow kindergartners determined I could be Batman. That was cool. So it was Batman and Goku, fighting Vegeta, on the playground. And as we started to grow up, right, first grade, second grade, we stopped being Batman and Goku, and we became our own, weird characters that we sort of cobbled together from different pieces. So, Batman had a lightsaber, and he went to wizard school, because, of course, Harry Potter came out and stuff. And as my friends grew up and started developing social skills and playing football, I wrote over recess, right? Because it's my only real free time. And I write in the back of my notes. If you look at my notes from middle school, there's no notes in them. It's just notes about made-up worlds and stuff. And so I finished my first novel in 9th grade. It's terrible. I have one copy left of it. And it's just a mess. It was an epic fantasy novel that midway through, it became a space opera novel. It was a big mess. And I've rewritten and changed everything. So the ship of Theseus, right? I replaced every plank and mast and sail in the bloody thing until it finally became what we got. And so there's no single moment, right? Robert E. Howard used to talk about, just looking up and seeing Conan in his mind's eye one day striding across the plains of Texas, right? Or J.K. Rowling talks about seeing Harry Potter on the train. I never had that. Tony was making fun of me before the podcast, about Hadrian being a self-insert. And I don't think that's true, but I can't really tell because I grew up with him, right? I don't know which parts of this character are me and which parts of him, which parts of me are him or vice versa. Because I've been writing some version of this person since I was in 2nd grade. And he's, of course, changed completely. And I think we've ended up having some pretty divergent opinions on certain things, but that's cool. Fiction shouldn't be representational, right? It should be exploratory. And so I've been exploring all these different ideas and all these different worlds that I've enjoyed. And that's how we got here slowly by accretion.
And I've seen you actually write short stories set in other worlds, and you're very good in that sense as well. So it's sort of an organic growth over time of this character. Then
the whole universe.
And you chose to write in the first person. And it's also told from the future, so we know in some sense Hadrian is there telling us this.
Yes.
And it's the older Hadrian, and he's like talking about often how he's vastly changed. And this is some mysterious future. Tell us, how'd you choose to do that? Did it just grow in?
I can't remember which book it was that convinced me to do it. It might have been Neil Stephenson's Anthem. It might have been D.J. McHale's Pendragon series, even. I don't remember, which is a YA series about parallel worlds. It was real popular in the aughts. And it could have been Name of the Wind, which I read once. It was pretty good.
Yeah. Well, Book of the New Sun is an iBook.
I read Book of the New Sun, actually, after I wrote Empire of Silence.
Oh, okay.
I was revising it. And I finally started it. I knew about Book of the New Sun, but I'd been rewriting the book over and over, and it just wasn't working. I was trying to do like a 4 point of view character, 6 point of view characters, Game of Thrones, sprawling galactic soap opera thing, and just couldn't do it. And I threw everything out, I think, in 2017, and I was like, I'm going to do it for real this time. I'm going to stop playing around. And I did a few changes. I changed a lot of place names just to make it feel like I was doing something new. I changed Hadrian's name. It had been Caleb, which is a worse name. I changed just everything. And I changed the voice I was writing in. And I can't remember which book it was. I finally was like, I'm going to do it because that book worked that way. It might have been Pendragon, because those are all written as letters the main character's sending across parallel universes to his friend, right? So some weird stuff's going on, because that's not supposed to happen, parallel worlds. But I'm not sure which book did it, and I decided to switch, and it just started working. And the distance that you get, because when you write first person, every word is characterization, right? It's not just the bits about the character that are. Every single word choice, Hadrian's weird philosophical tangents, right? All of this tells you something about who he is, who he was, and who he might be now.
Well, you like the older Hadrian introduces some very cool aphorisms into the text on occasion, which is really fun, because suddenly we get a saying of old Hadrian in there that amplifies and reflects back on the action.
Yeah, you get all these clever things you can do, and you can also too, because I hate when people get mad about spoilers, right? I remember after Avengers Endgame came out, it'd been like a month later, and the directors came on Good Morning America, and they're like, I think it's probably okay, you can all start talking about it now, as if I needed the director's permission to talk about a superhero movie. I hate spoiler culture, and so I wrote a book, right? And by writing it is a memoir, I can tell you how it ends on page 1, and then if I can still make it cool, right? We don't have to worry about plot spoilers, because it tells you page 1, I ended the war, I killed all of the aliens, and then you immediately meet this nice kid who would never do that, right? That gives you a different series of questions to work with and what's going to happen. Because you can get what's going to happen in a Wikipedia summary, but you can't get the experience in a Wikipedia summary. And so by taking that sort of thing off the table, I'm able to tell a different story about how someone changes, why they make choices, and are those choices justified. And I think that's more interesting than A, B, C, D, E, right?
Yeah, so what's next in the series, and what are you working on now?
So next is book 3, which is called Demon in White. It's going to be out July next year. I was supposed to have it done by tomorrow, because I'm going to Dragon Con, and then I'm going to Salt Lake FanX, and doing a tour with DJ Butler, Reed Witchy Eye. And I really want to be done before then, but it's not quite there. I'm working on this huge battle at the end of book 3. Spoilers. And it has just been slowing me down.
You have a book with a battle in it. Oh, dang.
Oh, yeah. No, huge one. There's some skirmishes and other ones. This is full scale.
Right.
So I'm working on that. And then after I do that, I'm working on another Baen anthology, finishing it up. It's called Overruled with Hank Davis, We're doing a bunch of stories, courtroom dramas, but with robots and aliens and wizards, all things collected from, the 50s, 60s, some even from a couple years ago. Tony's got a story in there. It's pretty awesome.
Ancient stories, yes.
Got an AI on trial, even though it didn't do anything. A copy of it did. Super cool. And then after that, got another one of those doing with Hank about space pirates. And I got a whole bunch of short stories I got to write. I got to do one for each of those. Got some other stuff. And I might be pitching comic books, but I can't say any more about that.
Well, that's really cool.
So
what was your title for the next in the series?
Demon in White. Should have the cover reveal very soon.
Yeah, but that is not. You said it's a tetralogy.
It's 5 books.
5 books.
Yeah. I managed to squeeze them for 5th one because
quintuple.
I think at this point it's just a cycle. I don't know what the fancy word is. I'm saying
a Baen trilogy, as we.
Yeah, it's a Baen trilogy by Daw.
Yes.
No, that's a whole nother story, man.
Yeah. So it's interesting that it is by Daw, and Daw's books are a little bit different from Baen books, but there are intersecting. How would you characterize how this would appeal to a Baen audience?
Well,
there's all kinds of Baen audiences from Lois Bujold to.
Oh yeah, well, it's definitely if you like Lois Bujold, it's got kind of that world building flavor. I got a couple, nods to Lois in there. Fabulous series. I'm a huge Miles fan. It's got a lot of the political wrangling you'd get from a David Weber. Less, technical specs on missiles. That's so far beyond me. How David does all that stuff is just, beyond me. It's amazing. But it is, what I like to think of it as kind of like, it's like a classic Sword and Planet, adventure story, right? Like Jack Vance, kind of like if you were to throw a lightsaber at like Solomon Kane, even, right? Hadrian's not quite there yet. I like to say when I'm pitching at conventions that it's like Star Wars if Anakin being Darth Vader was the best choice he had, right? And so it's got like, classic sort of pulp thing, but also with the philosophical edge, right? You can talk about stoicism and what the right way to behave is, and these sorts of things, but all against this backdrop of this huge interstellar war. So you're trying to do both, which means the book's got to be real long.
Yeah. Well, the current book in the Sun Eater cycle is The Howling Dark by Christopher Ruocchio. It's now at booksellers everywhere. Christopher, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for calling me over from my desk. Good time. Thanks, man.
Now we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of Son of the Black Sword by Larry Correia, Book 1 in the Saga of the Forgotten Warrior. After the War of the Gods, the demons were cast out and fell to the world. Mankind was nearly eradicated by the seemingly unstoppable beasts, until the gods sent the great hero Ram Rowan to save them. He united the tribes, gave them magic, and drove the demons into the sea. But as centuries passed, the descendants of the great hero grew in number and power. They became tyrannical and cruel, and their religion nothing but an excuse for greed. The people rose up, and the surviving royalty and their priests were made casteless, condemned to live as untouchables. The age of law had begun. Ashok Vidal has been chosen by a powerful ancient weapon to be its bearer. He is a protector, a member of an ancient military order of roving law enforcers. No one is more merciless in rooting out those who secretly practice the old ways as Ashok. But Ashok isn't who he thinks he is. And when he finds himself on the wrong side of the law, the consequences lead to rebellion, war, and perhaps transformation. Now here is the latest entry in Larry Correia's Son of the Black Sword.
The next morning, Jagdish turned over in his blanket and realized that his prisoner had escaped. The chains were lying discarded at the base of the tree he'd been tethered to. The manacles were still there, but somehow opened. Oceans! He threw off the blanket and reached for where he'd left his sword, but his hand hit nothing but pine needles. "Morning, Risolda. Did you sleep well?" Gutch was sitting on a rock a few yards away. Jagdish's sword was next to him, still sheathed. The prisoner seemed not only calm, but in a good mood. He gestured at the small cooking pot on the fire. "Breakfast?" Then he made a big show of glancing down at the sword. "Oh, this! I thought you might wake up cranky. Well, I know how you warriors like to cut folks down without thinking things through first." Gutch lifted the still-sheathed sword. "Now that you've taken a moment to wake up and realise that I refrained from doing anything bad to you, hopefully you won't be an arse about it and will grant me the same courtesy." Gutch tossed the sword over. Jagdish caught his blade but left it sheathed. "You could have murdered me in my sleep. I'm not that sort of criminal." "How'd you escape?" "A piece of wire, some mechanical know-how, and nothing else to do all night but work at the tumblers because my pillow was a tree." "I'm sorry. Was I supposed to have fluffed it for you?" Gutch laughed. The booming noise echoed through the forest and caused their horses to snort and pull at their ropes, and a flock of birds to leap into the air. "So now that we've established I'm not going to murder you or run away even when granted the opportunity, let's re-examine this working relationship of ours. In my caste, we do business willingly, entering pacts based on trust and respect, not threats. Okay, some threats, but only on special occasions. No more chains, and in fact, no more of this prisoner nonsense. To hell with the Inquisition, this journey counts as time served. No ordering me around. I'll keep helping you, but once you've murdered all these wizards and restored your honour and whatnot, I'm going to collect their magic fragments, sell them, and buy myself a palace. You strike me as a dedicated enough man to pull it off, and I've always wanted a palace. And a harem. A palace with a harem sounds reasonable. Partners?" That seemed like a very worker way of going about the endeavour, but Gutch's demonstration had been rather effective. "I agree with your terms." "You seem to take it so damned seriously. Give me your word." "Very well. You have my word as a warrior. Help me, Gutch. Your sentence is served, and afterwards loot the wizards as you see fit. I don't give a damn." Then he realised that a length of cord had been run through his sword scabbard and tied around the hilt. If he'd tried to draw, it would have slowed him. "What's this?" "A test of politeness." Gutch reached behind his rock and picked up a stout tree branch. In those massive hands, there was no doubt the improvised club would be extremely lethal. "If you try to pull on me, despite my exceedingly reasonable proposal, I'd have caved your head in." "Clever. Thank you. The sword you're looking for is—" Gutch frowned for just a moment, then pointed. "That way. The feeling is faint, but when Ashok uses it again, I'll be able to tell you approximately how many miles away it is." "No more spinning around and carrying on, then?" "Nope. I'm too big to keep prancing about like that. Some traveller might see me on the road twirling and tell their friends. Talk about damaging your reputation. Breakfast?"
That was another entry in the complete audiobook serialization of Son of the Black Sword by Larry Correia. And that's it for the podcast, thanks to Audible.com and to podcast theme composer Ruth Judkowitz. And a Roman Gladius transformer that turns into a BGM 109 Tomahawk missile when you utter the magic Latin phrase, Ake me ordswe aa isselme. Plus, thanks and praise for Christopher Ruocchio, author of The Howling Dark. Please join us next time here at the hammering heart of science fiction and fantasy, and keep reaching for the stars.